Now, what I wanted to get right from you was the order of the categories, because I had them listed in a particular way, but you kind of wanted to start with the provisioning, which you said was the kind of the bottom layer of the, or the kind of the first layer of the cake.
The
so
cake,
to speak.
yeah.
The cake, yes, the cake. Hello and welcome to the Cloud Focus channel. I'm Richard Simon. This is part 2 of the CNCF Landscape series. I have the pleasure of welcoming back Jason Morgan from Buoyant. Jason has been kind enough to do this series of talks with me. Hello, Jason. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing really well, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, thank you. So appreciate you again coming back for sort of this part 2. Just kind of for the viewers, if you're interested in all the details of sort of all the other stuff that we've discussed here, please go to part 1 and have a look at that. So for an intro to the CNCF, Jason himself and Buoyant and kind of the some of the other things that we've discussed, please go to part 1 of this talk series. All the details for everything else will be in the it'll be links and so on for the description and also in the playlist as well. Now, one of the things that we covered in part 1 was all the categories of the interactive landscape, the cloud native landscape. And these categories included provisioning, runtime, orchestration and management, application definition and development, platform, and also observability and analysis. We also covered the landscapes guide, which is a new feature that's been added recently. And the guide really provides lots of information around sort of each category, information of each category, and includes things like, what is that category for? What is the problem that it's trying to address? A little bit more around the sort of the technical aspect of all the projects within that category and so on. But as we said, this is going to be more of a tour of the landscape itself. So let's dive straight into that.
All right. So for those that remember, this is the Cloud Native Landscape. You've likely seen it before. I think we can zoom out a little bit. Geez, that's way smaller than I intended. Anyhow, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of start at the bottom and head up. So let's check out the provisioning layer. First thing we have is automation and configuration. So you might have heard this last time, you might not, but when you go into the individual sections, or until you go into the individual sections of this view, you can only actually see graduated and incubating projects in the CNCF. And that is like, where are they on the CNCF maturity ladder, right? So KubeEdge is our incubating project. And then we have things like Acri, the CDK, or CDKs, SuperEdge and Tinkerbell, all sorts of tooling that are trying to move up the CNCF ladder. This is also where you see like, Ansible, Chef, Bosch, for those of you that got to use Cloud Foundry, Pulumi or Terraform, all the tools you need to take your infrastructure, whether it's VMs, whether it's Metal, and get it ready to start actually running whatever your thing is. And there's really just a ton of stuff in here. Beyond that, we can pop back over the landscape. The next thing we have, right, because this is our foundational layer for our Kubernetes or our container environment. Beyond that, we have our container registry. So, all the cloud container registries are here. Artifactory, which basically everybody's heard of. You also have the CNCF graduated registry, which is Harbor. It's super cool. I'm a big fan. I used to use it all the time. Still love it. This is where you have Quay, right? Another good registry that does some container scanning. Dragonfly, which I don't know a ton about, but I believe it's there to help you like distribute your registries more broadly, right? This is, at some point you're going to have container images that you work with. You're ideally keeping them in your own private registry, right? So that you can do scanning, so that you can keep them available no matter what happens with the provider, stuff like that. You want to dive into any of them, or
no? I think that's fine. I think the only thing, as you said, is that each of the sort of the layers of the cake, as we mentioned in part 1, actually has these sort of subcategories as well. So kind of for viewers, it's important that they look at each of those subcategories to see which of the what projects are in those subcategories, not just kind of provisioning and then you've got kind of some fairly well-known projects within that space, but it's actually multiple sort of subcategories in each one as well. So I think that's just the extra point there.
Yep. And if you're trying to get a sense of like what does it mean, right? Like security compliance, you can always pop open the landscape guide for that section, right?
Yeah.
Get a technical intro, getting a sense of what are the projects, right there, very well written out. And like, what are some buzzwords? So if you're hearing like terms like, oh, geez, we got to do something about image scanning. Well, turns out that's the security and compliance section. So let's pop in, right? This is where you find image scanning tools. This is where you find, incubating. You have Cert Manager, which if you haven't used that, check it out. It's wonderful. It'll rotate and generate certificates for you programmatically. This is where you have Falco and Dex, Notary. If you're trying to do some image signing, which if you're building your own images, look for something that does image signing. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Open Policy Agent, kind of all kinds of things. And of course,
Opa's a favorite of mine, actually. Yeah.
And then all sorts of other open source and proprietary tools, right? Just if they don't have any blue around them, basically around the boundary, then they're likely open source if it's a white background. And if it's a gray background, it means it's a proprietary tool.
Right.
So that's our security and compliance. Key management, right? So where you find Spiffy and Spire, the things that are going to get you, who's going to generate the certificates that you're going to use and how are you going to distribute any secrets that you have around the environment. This is where you find Vault, right? Which is a great, oops, I didn't mean to do that, but let's actually pop into some of these because that's kind of worth doing. A great secret storing tool. We can look, if you click on any of the logos, right, you get, where does it come from? What's the website? So let's go pop out and check out Spiffy, right? Oh, look, Spiffy, it's a identity control plane. Here's a whiteboard video that you can see. And, every project's got a different quality of site. You can go to their Git repo, go to Crunchbase, whatever. And that's our kind of brief tour around provisioning, right? So there we've got stuff to make your infrastructure exist, right? Stuff to store your images, those primitives that you're going to need to do container stuff, tooling around how are we going to secure this darn thing, and then key and secret management. Oops, didn't mean to do that.
So it's all, it's all kind of focusing on that, building up that sort of base for your environment in the cloud, right? That's kind of really the idea of that, right? From the provisioning point all the way to security and so on.
Yeah, it's our foundational layer for our microservice environment. Then runtime, this is actually weirdly, it's both really important and super boring, right? This is the stuff that's going to run our containers, right? Like, so runtime, we have, how are we going to schedule the containers? How are we actually going to start that image that we're storing in our private registry? What are we going to do as far as storage, right? Because we're going to want to attach storage to it. And we need a mechanism to do it, right? And then how are we going to do networking, right? Which is like, these are all foundational, crucial, and kind of like how does the water get around your house? Like, I don't know, man, it does, right? Like, I just shower. I'm not worried about how the water gets there. But this is our plumbing category, right? Sure. That's probably a good way to say it. The plumbing part of our cake. So don't think too much about that analogy. So looking at storage, right? We see a bunch of CNCF projects, right? Including Rook and Longhorn, right? Longhorn, I think, just became incubating recently, although I'm not positive, and a lot of other things, right? This is where you have Valero, right? The great backup cluster backup tool from the folks over at VMware. Although it's not, it's weird. I'm pretty sure I thought Valero was a CNCF tool, but I guess I was wrong. As well as a bunch of proprietary things. But this is things that you need for storage or backup or recovery. This is where you have Minio, right? If anyone's done like on-prem data storage and you're like, man, I would love something S3 compatible. Like, I love Minio for that. Of course, this is where you have tons of great proprietary solutions too. I
mean, I think the ones that are sort of standouts for me are Rook, Container D. I think Cilium's kind of been had a lot of sort of focused on it recently. Ceph kind of from my sort of software defined storage days, and then CRIO or Cryo, RKT or Rocket for the runtimes, and then CNI, of course, for kind of integration with Kubernetes, as well as CSI, of course, on the storage side.
Yeah, you're jumping between my categories, but yeah, absolutely, right? Like that, but this is where all that foundational stuff lives, right? So hopping over to CRI or container runtime, we have Containerd, we have Rocket, we have Firecracker if you're doing Amazon VMs, Enclaver, which I actually haven't even heard of yet, Kata containers, right, which I've been seeing forever, LXD, like lots of stuff that's really cool if you need to get to know it, but for a lot of us, it kind of slips below the radar. It's like, I don't know, man, I start containers and they work, right?
Well, that's the whole point, is to actually come in and explore some of these projects, right? And kind of you know, for developers and people kind of, you know, in SRE roles and DevOps engineering roles. That's the whole idea, right?
Right, absolutely, right? When you're building out your platform, you're going to have to select things in here, right? And then we go to cloud native networking, right? This is where we see Antria, right? Which is a very cool CNI. We see Cilium, right? Like if you've heard a lot of eBPF talk lately, right? Like it probably came out of Cilium because of all the cool stuff they've been doing there, right? Calico, right? If you like software-defined networking, another great option. Calico, pretty sure Antria has stuff in there, but I haven't dug in for a while. This is where you find the container network interface, which is like what powers, you know, that ability to swap out your various CNIs. Like Flannel's in here, right? Like if you've done like a vanilla cluster, you've almost certainly used Flannel,
pretty much,
and of course, you know, all sorts of proprietary SDNs are here as well. And so that's our runtime layer, right? The tooling, you know, the tooling we need to get our containers stored or our containers run, a place for them to persist data to, and then a way for them to talk to each other that kind of exists down at runtime. So you see, it's still foundational. It's a bit above that provisioning, but it's still really low level. Yeah,
you're still kind of building up stuff and getting your sort of environment ready, really, at that stage.
Right. And go next, we have orchestration and management, right? Like a big term. This category, honestly, or this column or row, whatever. I don't really remember the difference between row and column. I know it's one or the other. Anyway, this chunk, this layer of our cake, is a little bit more eclectic than the others, right? For the others, we tended to have a theme. This one seems to be catches stuff that's not app development centric, but isn't necessarily as foundational, right? But with that being said, this is also where we see, you know, under orchestration management, right? We have Kubernetes. So if you're doing cloud native stuff today, there's a really good chance you're using Kubernetes or something very similar, like, you know, Docker Swarm or Nomad or Mesos, right? To actually schedule your containers. So this is where your container scheduler lives. This is where Crossplane lives, right? If everyone's seen the cool stuff that you can do with Crossplane to, you know, have Kubernetes provision your infrastructure. So it's kind of a nice cross between that low level provisioning and this higher level orchestration management. So tons of stuff in there. And of course, this is the category that contains Kubernetes itself. Going beyond that, coordination and service discovery, right? Like we need DNS. We need to know, right, as we're spinning up a bunch of containerized instances, they need to find a way, or they need to have a way to find each other, right? And that's where tools like Core DNS, Zookeeper, whatever, Eureka, right? If anyone remembers using Eureka, you know, that's where these things exist. And it's also where etcd lives, right? And like pretty key to Kubernetes, right? Except unless you're using K3S, is etcd, right? It's what allows you to kind of scale and pop things out really well, right? Then remote procedure call. So when we wrote our original guide on this, like I ended up being very sarcastic about this category, right? Because, you know, it's the RPC category, which doesn't really seem to fit with anything else in the landscape. But, you know, I think Google donated gRPC to the CNCF, and so they had to find a category for it. But this is where gRPC lives, which, you know, sure, remote procedure call is important if that's the type of if you're writing an app that uses it, great.
Yeah.
Very, very valuable. Service proxy, right? Now, again, this is, when you think of Kubernetes or any containerized environment, right? We've got our apps that are running probably in containers, and they're doing stuff with each other and they're talking, but we have to have some way for the outside world to get in, right? And that's where our service proxy lives, right? So this is where we find Envoy, right? Like if you've been around the space for a while, you've probably heard of Envoy, the graduated project. It is like this really powerful, mature proxy written by the folks over at Lyft and adopted as part of Istio. Oops, didn't mean to knock my mic there. This is where you have things like Contour, which is a special ingress from the folks over at VMware. This is where you have Traffic, or the Traffic proxy, Nginx. I think pretty well everyone who's doing a first time
pretty much
ingress is using Nginx, right? So there's a bunch of tooling in here. This is where Inlets is. If anyone hasn't checked out Inlets from OpenFaz, if you're doing something in your house and you want a really cheap way to expose it to the internet, check out Inlets. It's wonderful.
Cool.
I have very good things to say about it, but I won't jam. I won't drone on any longer. Do you want me to? Is it still a good pace, or?
Yeah,
keep going.
Good. Yeah, keep going. Yeah, that's cool.
So that's our service proxy, right? How are we getting the traffic in? But then we have other things that we need. One of them being an API gateway. Right now, not everyone's going to use this, right? But I'll tell you, if you have a use case, an API gateway is extremely powerful.
Yeah.
This is where you see the emissary ingress recently donated and already moved up to an incubating project.
Wow.
Right. This is based off the Envoy proxy. It's awesome. I use it all the time. There's also a commercial version in the Ambassador Edge stack. This is where you see all types of things, right? MuleSoft, Kong, the Glue Edge. WSO2 and their API micro gateway. There's a lot of stuff here, right? But the API gateway, when I talk about API gateway and service mesh, I generally think of it as, an API gateway exists to handle your business logic, right? It's there to say, I want to limit rates, or I want, to do a different class of service for users on my gold plan than on my silver plan. Or, I want to monitor and measure transactions so that I can do chargeback, or all kinds of other things. But right, API gateway is a very important part of your environment. And like, I run in a lot to kind of what is the difference between an API gateway and what sits in our next category, which is a service mesh, right? So I'm the Linkerd person, so this category is important to me, right?
Absolutely.
But in general, if an API gateway is there for your business logic, right, and to take the cross-cutting business concerns and put them in one place, a service mesh is there to take operational logic out of your various microservices and move it into a central place, and that place being the service mesh run by your platform team, right? So this is where you find lots of good commercial offerings. You also find, obviously, the Linkerd service mesh, which is the only graduated service mesh in the space, not to brag.
Sorry, you're allowed to brag a little bit.
I was definitely bragging. Yeah. This is also where you find Open Service Mesh, Kuma, right? Which I haven't used, but I hear really good things about. This is where you find Console from HashiCorp. And there's two consoles, right? There's the Service Discovery Console and the Service Mesh Console. And a bunch of other proprietary meshes, as well as open source meshes. Okay. So that's orchestration management. Does that all kind of make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's you've got some very sort of well-known projects in there with sort of, Kubernetes and core DNS cross-plane, which is again quite interesting. I think you pointed that out. Istio kind of on the service mesh side, Contour we talked about, and then some kind of more of the sort of the background stuff that really kind of fills up these projects, like gRPC, etcd, and so on as well. But again, still quite crucial ones, and still building up that layer of the cake, right?
Right. And so now what we've done is we've got really our infrastructure and our kind of platform ops stuff largely lives in those spaces with some exceptions, right? Like that API gateway tends to be more of a business ops or application ops rather than platform ops. So this is the first layer where we start to see a move from the platform builder to something more application centric. And then when we get up to this app definition development, this is where we see like our move into either developer stuff, or whether you call them DevOps or your CI/CD folks. This is where we start to see more developer enablement and developer specific tools. So let's take a look at app definition and development. So we start off with database, right? So like you need disk coming out of CNI, but like beyond that, right? Like you're probably going to run a database somewhere. You might not run it in Kubernetes, but you're going to have a database for your application if you're running anything particularly useful. And so this is where everything from MySQL to this TICV, I think TIKV or TICV. I've always said TICV, so I hope I'm not saying it wrong. Vitess, Yugabyte.
Because it's mine.
Okay. Yugabyte, which is a big, like a very scalable Postgres database. It's also where you find Postgres. You know, all sorts of proprietary databases, right? Including like SQL Server, MongoDB, whatever it may be. This is where everything database related lives. And
there's kind of your sort of standard databases, and there's also this kind of the so-called key value store type of stuff as well, right?
Yeah. So TICV is a KV store, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You know, then going beyond it, right? Like, cool, great, right? We've got our databases, but maybe we're doing like an event-driven architecture, or you know, we just want a way to put messages on an MQ, which is a pretty common task. This is where streaming and messaging comes in, right? So we have Nats, we have, where is it? RabbitMQ. I could have sworn Kafka's in here, right? If anyone's not familiar with RabbitMQ and Kafka, they're like very big names in the messaging space, right? As well as proprietary things, right? Because your cloud vendors want to give you an easy way to like publish and subscribe to events in their environment. You know, Apache Spark, right? The open source project is over here, as well as some CNCF stuff, right? Like Tremor and Strimzy and Praviga, which I don't know anything about actually.
I mean, there's lots in every category, right? So I guess, I mean, you know, I just for the viewers to go and explore a lot more of these as well. There's just so much happening.
And it's rapidly changing, right? Like there's, you know, when we were writing our article series originally, like we kept snapshotting the picture all the time because it kept updating, right? Cool. Streaming and messaging and database is like half of the application and provisioning layer, right? So they're app-centric things, but they're like, you know, kind of infrastructure things, kind of application things, right? Who provisions your database is probably very political in your own environment. When we move into app definition and image build, we kind of start to see, like, this is my favorite category and also the broadest, right? So this is where we have Helm. And if you haven't used Helm, like, it is for me the absolute best way to consume vendor provided apps. I love it in terms of packaging. You know, I don't always think that I want to use Helm to deploy my own apps, but I really like it when I'm consuming other people's apps through Helm. And there are definitely great uses, and Helm is a powerful tool if you do use it for your own applications. Speaking of which, this is where we have Artifact Hub, right? This is a sandbox one, but a lot of CNCF projects are actually hosting stuff over at Artifact Hub. So when you go to consume a Helm chart, it is quite often hosted over here at Artifact Hub, and you can go check that out. This is where you have Backstage. Near and dear to my heart, you have the incubating project, which is buildpacks.io, right? And buildpacks envisions a world where, you know, if you've ever used Heroku or Cloud Foundry, you know, you had this fantastic experience that you could sum up in this little haiku, right? Which is, here is my code, run it in the cloud for me. I do not care how. And with buildpacks, they take that and they say, hey, we're going to inspect what your application code is, and we're going to build it into a container for you. And there are some real advantages to doing that I absolutely don't have time to get into, but check it out. It's a very cool project, and it may make sense for your use case, right?
And anything that kind of really helps in that sort of build process, right? That kind of automates that and takes a bit of the burden away. That's always
yeah.
useful.
If you don't like writing Docker files, build packs is
Yeah,
is the thing to use, right? This is also where you find the operator framework, right? So basically, everyone using Kubernetes today is consuming something that does that operator pattern, right? Of, we've got a thing running in Kubernetes. It watches its own new custom object type, and then it does stuff with it, right? And that's where that exists. It's where you can find Scaffold. If you've gotten a chance to use it, it's pretty neat.
Yeah.
A lot of other developer productivity tools like Octeto. Geez, I know there's some others. This is where tools like Code Server live, but I don't think it's actually in this landscape. You also have great tools like Tilt and Telepresence, which is also a sandbox project. Great way to kind of teleport. I'm a nerd about this. It's a great way to make it look like your local development environment is running in a Kubernetes cluster, and it's pretty handy. So we'll pop out. And then my second favorite category, right? I'm a CI/CD person, right? That's how I got into this whole thing.
All right.
So my second favorite category is this continuous integration and delivery. Now there's a whole continuous delivery foundation, right? Which has a lot to offer and stuff to check out. But here's where you'll find, if you've heard GitOps, right? Which you probably have, because it's quite the buzzy topic.
Yeah.
This is where you find tools like CNCF incubating tools like Flux and Argo CD, right? Which are both different approaches to doing the same thing, right? Where you put your Kubernetes configuration in a Git repo, because at the end of the day, it's all YAML. And then you have a tool sync that YAML to your cluster in different ways. Really neat tools. It's also where you'll find, GoCD, Jenkins X, all the Jenkins variants, Spinnaker, Tecton. There's just really too much to really mention, right? But this is where all the tooling that goes from, you've got an artifact that you've produced and you want to make sure it's good, to we've got a thing that is running in your cluster and users can take traffic. It's also where Flagger lives, right? Which is a continuous or a progressive delivery tool. So you can kind of test your deployments. Argo's got Argo rollouts, which is a very similar thing. Concourse CI, which I love, but I'm not gonna bore anyone with now. And yeah, so these are like the main layers of the cake, right? So from provisioning, we get our infrastructure. From runtime, we make it work. Orchestration management, we turn it into this Kubernetes environment. And then app definition and development, we start doing some stuff that might add some value to our organization. Fingers crossed, adds value to our organization, right? And that's great, right? And now on the side here, we've got some cross-cutting layers, right? Specifically platform and observability analysis. So, look at this stack, right? From provisioning up to orchestration management, there's a lot of choices in there, right? I look at this thing like a couple times a week, every week, and I don't know all the pieces that are in here, right? So there's a lot of options. And so over here at platform, you'll see like an opinionated stack effectively out of these layers in your certified Kubernetes distribution. So let's actually pop in. So platform, these are your platforms. This is all the bits stuff together, right? So you have certified Kubernetes distributions. So that's something that is either commercially available or open source that is like, hey, this is your Kubernetes cluster. So when I spin up a new cluster locally and I use K3D, right? I'm spinning up the K3S Kubernetes distribution, which I'm pretty sure is in here. So I'm pretty sure is in here, right? There it is, right there. So I'm spinning up K3S, but maybe I want to spin up K0s or, whatever, or like the AWS EKSD, which I don't actually know anything about that. I assume it's some open source version of EKS. From everything to that to all the different vendor-based Kubernetes distributions that you can run in your own way. Right. And that's great if you want to run it on your own infrastructure in your own way. But then you also have hosted Kubernetes. So imagine you don't want to run the infrastructure. You're just like, folks, I want someone to please give me a Kubernetes cluster and I'm just going to consume it and you can handle the work. You have a ton of commercial offerings where they will spin you up your own kube cluster in their infrastructure and you'll pay for it. I'm pretty sure these are all, even if it's not open source, you're still paying for it, right? These are the hosted Kubernetes offerings. I'm sorry.
I mean, I was just going to say, so it's kind of, you have a plethora of choices. You can kind of roll your own and do your own stuff, and maybe that's kind of useful for when you're kind of doing, dev and test and things like that. But then kind of when you come to production stuff, you can also look at, supported platforms as well from all these vendors.
Like, listen, tons of people use their own, the distributions on their own infrastructure, and it's common, right? But it just depends what's your appetite and to what amount of control do you need, right? And for a lot of folks, the Kubernetes as a service, I used to call them the star KSs when I was selling it. They give you the fastest let's go button, right? And then you've got a kube config and you can get rolling. I'd call out Civo if you haven't checked it out. It's a really nice offering, really cheap. Enjoy it. They're very new to the scene. Going past our hosted, right? We've got Kubernetes installers, right? So if you're doing like a CKA, maybe not a CCAD, but if you're doing a CKA or really any sort of like messing with Kubernetes, there's tooling in here that's going to make your life better, right? Like this is where kubeadm lives. I was very confident before I looked. It's where I thought kubeadm lived. Might be in another one. But this is where Kind sits. This is where RKE sits, which is Rancher's tool for provisioning Kubernetes. It's where Minikube sits, a bunch of different tooling. And I could have sworn K3D was in here somewhere, but maybe not.
See, Jason, you were getting caught out by the rapid change of the landscape itself, right?
Rapid pace of change, yeah.
Exactly.
And then you have PaaS and container service. This section seems like a bit of a afterthought, if I'm being honest. But there's great tooling in here, right? Like I can tell you, Cloud Foundry is still out there for folks that are using it. It's awesome. So we find Heroku also an absolutely fantastic option, as well as others that are trying to make it so that you can know even less than you have to know with Kubernetes, right? Like, because Kubernetes is great if you have a bunch of dials that you need to tune, right? You can tune, the most dials by building your own stack. You can cut down that number by taking somebody else's distribution. You can cut it down further by doing hosted Kubernetes. And this is the least control, but ideally, if your use case fits, the most developer velocity, where you have much fewer dials, but you've got the ability to just go from either container or code all the way through to something that's running that you can share with your customers.
Right.
And that's platform, right? So the goal here is make choices of these open source things and curate the experience for you a little bit. Then beyond all of that, right? If you manage to build something and people like it, or you just care about it, right? After that, you really want to know that it works, or hopefully you want to know that it works. And that's where observability and analysis comes in, right? Either know that it works or make sure it works, because I slipped in a category that seems a little bit off for the broader name, but is still very important to keeping your stuff highly available.
So if you haven't torn your hair out of your proverbial hair out for people like me, then you'll get to this stage, to this category.
Yeah. Right. So now we're going to want to monitor it, right? So you've got a ton of proprietary options. You also have great things like Cortex. I think this is where Grafana lives, Grafana and Prometheus.
Just there, you just missed that.
Oh, okay.
Just missed Grafana.
So this is where Prometheus lives, Thanos. All sorts of tooling that will allow you to collect metrics and then display them in some kind of useful way, right? And as just like with everything else, right? It's how much do you want to build versus how much do you want to buy in the commercial space.
We won't go into definitions for observability and AI ops and visibility and all the other stuff, because that's always in flux, it seems, and quite controversial sometimes as well. So we'll leave that alone. We'll just focus on what's in the category.
Yeah, thank you. Keep me from getting in trouble. So after that, right, so we've got monitoring, right? So we're going to monitor stuff in some way, and we're going to build our monitoring platform, or we're going to buy a monitoring platform. But like metrics are one component, but beyond that, we're also going to want to know about logs, right? Like log data is probably really important to your environment, right? So this is where FluentD lives, which if you've used it, it's a very common tool to get log data out. It's also where all the log vendors live, right? And I really don't have anything to say about that beyond that's where you can find it. But log messages obviously are critical to whatever you're doing. Be it tracing, right? So like tracing gets a little bit confusing, or at least it was confusing to me, right? So
of the club.
Yeah. So the thing is, right, like as you have all these microservices, right, that are talking to each other, or even whether they're microservice, regardless of the size of the services, when you have a bunch of individual components that are sending, REST messages all over the place, and you have this chain of calls that are going to make out like one useful thing that happened for a user, right? It's a really good idea if you can see, where did that user request or that initial mover start, and where did it end, and what were the steps along the way? Right. And so tracing aims to answer that for you, right? So this is where you see tools like Jaeger. This is where you see open telemetry and open tracing, as well as some third-party tools, right? And their goal is to give you a good sense of what really happened end to end on the things that are really going on in your application. Right. And this is all part of understanding like what's really happening in your environment. I don't have a ton more to say here, but check it out. And if it's useful to you, and if you need that level of detail, like tracing can be really valuable.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly part of, still part of that sort of observability sort of landscape, isn't it? All of these things come in handy, and if you're kind of applying, further other sort of third-party tools or commercial tools, then obviously that adds more value to the things that you're doing, and these tools are there to kind of generate that level of detail that you need.
Yeah. Now, be aware, right, with tracing, right, like as far as I can tell, right, tracing is something that ultimately your application code is going to need to support, right? So none of this stuff is free, right? And that being said, I haven't looked through all the commercial products, so I can't tell you none of them require, or that they all require application code changes or don't. Really, I don't know. But I can tell you on the open source stuff, if you're doing it right, be prepared that tracing is valuable, but that value, even when it's open source, it's free like a puppy, right? Like it requires work and maintenance on your end to keep tracing valuable for your scenario. And that gets us to the last category in observability analysis, which doesn't fit, but it totally fits at the same time, right? Which is chaos engineering.
Yes.
Right? Because like the reality is, if you're running something in production, things are gonna break. Right? Like, and you can do two things. You can optimize to avoid failures, or you can optimize to recover, right? And if you look at Accelerate, or the book Accelerate by Nicole Forsgren and other authors that I should remember but don't remember off the top of my head, they talk about high performing organizations, and very high performing organizations tend to optimize for mean time to recovery. And a great way to get good at fixing stuff is to break things in a controlled fashion, right? So this is where you see Chaos Mesh. This is where you see Litmus Chaos, which are both open source. They're only sandbox projects inside the CNCF, but they're awesome. Chaos Blade, which I'm actually not familiar with at all. It's also where you find Gremlin. It's a great commercial tool in the space. I don't know SteadyBit, so I have no opinion there. Nothing bad to say, nothing good to say. I just don't know it. But this is where, if you're looking at, gee, I want my app to be reliable, right? Get good at fixing it, right? And these chaos testing tools give you a lot of ability to break things in a Kubernetes specific way or in a general way, but in a controlled fashion, so that you can get good at recovery, right?
Well, Jason, thank you very much for this tour of the CNCF Interactive Cloud Native Landscape. really useful. And as always, I always learn so much from doing all of these talks. So thank you for, I think, really appreciate that. So I will be providing links in the description of the talk. So if people kind of want to go and check out some of these things, all the sort of links for the locations for the stuff and all the other details will be in the description of the talk. Just a reminder that obviously we have part 1 for viewers if you want to kind of get a little bit more about the intro to CNCF, the landscape, how it's kind of put together and so on. Jason did that part 1 for us, so have a look at that. Again, in the description of this video, and most likely a playlist as well on it. And obviously, Jason, you and I are due to do one on Linkerd, where we'll kind of focus on sort of that project from Buoyant as well in the future. Are you up for that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you for having me.
Cool, excellent. Okay, yeah. So Ollie leaves me to thank you again. Very useful talk, and we'll see you next time.
Awesome.
Thank you very much for watching this talk. If you enjoyed the content, please comment, share, like, and subscribe to support the channel. See you next time.